How are you doing out there, everyone? I'm Tim Derling, and this is Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Thanks for watching. On today's episode, it's kind of a mishmash, really. I'm going through my Nazareth collection, and Nazareth is a group that has got a ton of albums. They started releasing albums in 1971. They've never really stopped. There's been lineup changes, of course, but their most recent one came out in 2018. And I'm sure that there's as many albums I don't have, maybe more than what I actually do have. But I still have a lot. They're a very prolific band. Just a good, the best way I could describe them is a good, reliable rock and roll band. You can just put one of their albums on and it's just good rock. They were an early pioneer of a more commercial sounding hard rock, that is for sure. In some cases, metal. And they did quite well for themselves in Europe, vast parts of Europe. The funny thing is, even though they did have a few moments of airplay and success in the States, they've always done way, way better in Canada. And as a matter of fact, in some ways they're considered sort of honorary Canadians. I'll kind of get into that a little bit. I had the pleasure of seeing them live in Woodstock in 2010 and actually met Dan McCafferty and Pete Agnew, the singer and bass player for Nazareth, and got their autographs, but we'll get into that later. So, first couple of Nazareth albums are really, really hard to find. I do not have them. The first one was self-titled from 71, and the second one was called Exercises, came in 1972. I think the band at large came on most people's radar in 73 with their third album, Razamanaz, with, a very, very simple cover, but just the thing that would have stood out in a record rack in 1973, really at any time. It just kind of demands your attention. This, of course, contained the title song, which is fast and it's kind of out of control. It's kind of like a rock and roll by Led Zeppelin, but just a really, really fun song. Woke Up This Morning is on this, Bad, Bad Boy. This is a Canadian edition on A&M. They were on various labels throughout the world, but for most of their, I guess you could say, hit-making career, they were on A&M Records. So there's Canadian address for A&M Records. This is a gatefold. Live shots of the band. At various times, they've been a 4-piece, sometimes they've been a 5-piece, sometimes they've been a 6-piece. Most of the time, though, they're a 4-piece. And instead of the gatefold coming out on one of the ends, it actually comes out the middle here. This is a pretty old version of this, safe to say. And A&M, of course, not a rock label, not really, definitely not a hard rock label, as you can see by some of the other examples of the records that are available. We've got Carole King, Cheech and Chong, Keith Hampshire. We're really getting Canadian here. Valdy, Lawrence Hudd. Now, this is interesting. Lawrence Hudd originally wrote the song Sign of the Gypsy Queen that April Wine. Anyway, that's another story. So on the other side, we have the Carpenters, Billy Preston, Joan Baez, Rick Wakeman. That's sort of half rock solo albums. And of course, Cat Stevens, one of the best, probably the best known acts on A&M Records. This is what the record itself looked like, this old label here. And also have this on a very well-worn 8-track. This is also a Canadian issue. And what's really cool about Canadian A&M 8-tracks is that they had actually artwork on the back. There's a band shot on the back here, which is kind of cool. Very, very, this one's probably seen some parties. The next thing to come out, very prolific band, released another album in 73. Another really striking, cool album cover. Loud and Proud, another good album. This is a Canadian edition. This one contained one of their best known songs, their cover of Joni Mitchell's This Flight Tonight. Now, given that it was written by a Canadian artist, this still gets tons of airplay in Canada because it classifies as Canadian content. It was actually, I think, a top 20 single for them in Canada. So it was the beginning of them starting to do better in Canada than in the States. This also has Not Faking It, great song, Turn On Your Receiver. They do a lot of cover songs, but they don't pick run-of-the-mill ones. And they always do them very, very well. Now, I think this is probably an issue from the later 80s because of the label that's used. This label I've only ever seen in like the mid-1980s. I think that Y&T's Down for the Count record has this label on it. And also have that one on 8-track in much better shape than the Razamanaz one. another Canadian one, and also a band photo on the back. Some of their CDs weren't easy to find for a long time. They reissued them in, I think around 2009, 2010 on a company called Salvo. And this is the version I have of Loud and Proud on CD. This has a few extra songs on it, some BBC cuts, and some more photos. For instance, this photo here is the same as on the 8-track. And booklet that comes with it, of course, because it's a reissue. You know, there's a retrospective on the band. The next album that came out was in 1974. It's called Rampant. I don't have that on anything right now. Their biggest album, and I think in most of the world, came out in 1975. I'll show you here. Hair of the Dog. Love this album art. This is it's a Canadian copy. Not a gatefold. It was meant to be though, because this picture wraps around. This is this was the biggest Nazareth album. The title song is a classic song which you've probably heard tons of times before. If you don't know it by the title Hair of the Dog, the chorus actually goes son of a bitch. So that's the song. And in the internet, the early internet days of downloading, it was most often attributed to AC/DC in error. Dan McCafferty's vocals are very, very raspy, but he predates Brian Johnson. So who influenced who? We're not sure. What else is on this? Miss Misery is a good heavy one. Beggar's Day is a great song. The last song on here, Please Don't Judas Me, I've heard Metallica do a version of that. They've never covered it, but I've heard them do it live, at least acoustically. Would have been very cool to hear a full produced version of that. Same one as that you've seen in some of the other records too, and the same A&M logo. The only other thing I have that on is CD. This is one of the rare ones that you can find as a US pressing. This is a US CD on A&M. And there's much else in here. You know, a half version of the cover. So in 1975, by this time, they were, headlining in a lot of places around the world. In Canada, they must have been doing really, really well. Because their first Greatest Hits album, the first of many compilations, came out. It's a classic album that anybody in Canada who's ever looked for used albums will see this a lot. So it must have sold very, very well. Let's start out with the vinyl. Yeah, you've seen this before, I'm sure, if you've gone record crate digging. And if you've never really listened to Nazareth, do yourself a favor and pick this up. This wasn't issued in the States. What they ended up with was a compilation called Hot Tracks, which came out a year later. But this is this is classic. It's on A&M Records, but it's all the versions I've seen have a different numbering system on it, have a Canadian numbering system on it. And this is a pretty good 12-song compilation of everything that they've done, their highlights up to this point. Note, it doesn't feature their first 2 albums here, just the 4 that came after. So this has a nice, as easy it is to find this, it's cool if you can find one in good shape. This has a heavy cardboard insert, and the record itself is the same A&M label that we've been seeing on a lot of these. Next up, the thing I've had the longest, I think, is the CD version. This is a Canadian Columbia House version. How much more 70s can you get than a disco ball? When you're able to, you can usually pick this CD up at most Walmarts, and it's usually not very expensive. I think $8 or something like this. This is worth adding to your collection. I've got this on the most copies, on the most formats, I should say. This is a Canadian cassette, reissue cassette on A&M. I've seen this in a lot of different issues as well. And finally, of course, sort of a pride of my collection, my only autographed 8-track. This is the Greatest Hits 8-track. It's a Canadian Columbia House issue. and it's signed by Dan McCafferty and Pete Agnew when I met them in 2010. Now, I didn't just get them to sign an old 8-track. That, to me, would be borderline insulting. I think to some artists, some might not be, but I'd always make sure I got something recent signed, which I do, and I'll tell you about that when we get to it. But yeah, this is really, really cool. They're the two founding members, of course, and Dan no longer with the band, but Pete is the sole remaining founding member. The next thing that they put out, 1976, was Close Enough for Rock and Roll. This is a Canadian edition, and it's a gatefold cover of a bunch of fans crowded around at what appears to be an empty limo, which open it up in the back, the band are crowded into there. This has a heavy cardboard sleeve with it as well. And continuing the Canadian theme here, there's a song here called Vancouver Shakedown. And we're still using the same, there's no customization going on yet. Also have that album on cassette. This is a Canadian reissue. I don't know from what point it is. It looks 80s, it doesn't look 70s, but it's hard to tell. And it's one of the only other US CDs that are easy to find. This is a US CD version of this. I'm not sure at what point this would have been issued, but I can't see it being reissued by A&M in the States. Okay, next up. Also 1976, this was a very prolific band, and a lot of these bands were putting out 2 albums a year, called Playing the Game. And this is a Canadian issue. Still using the heavy cardboard inserts, which is cool because those are the ones that last. Same label here. So I'm missing one in 1977. They put out an album called Expect No Mercy. I don't have that one. The next one is from 1979, one of my favorite album covers of theirs, designed by a guy named Rodney Matthews, called No Mean City. This album contains one of my favorite Nazareth songs called May the Sun Shine. This is a Canadian A&M reissue. Originally, I'm sure it was issued as a gatefold, so you could see the whole thing. But this is a very, very cool bit of artwork. And same A&M label. Now it's in these protective sleeves that gives you advice on how you protect your records. I have a few like that. I have another Salvo reissue, and this is the No Mean City CD version, which came out in 2010. So this is what the gatefold would have looked like. There's a better look at it right there. At this point, for a few albums, they were a 6-piece actually. And there's a big write-up about that album in here. So then I'm missing a couple more. In 1980, they had kind of a semi-big comeback album called Malice in Wonderland. The song Holiday came off that. That was a big hit single for them, especially in Canada, not so much in the States. And I think later in 1980 or 81, I can't remember which one it was, they had an album called The Full Circle. Next thing I'm going to show you is one of my favorite sort of unsung live albums. I've talked about this release before. First of all, I'll show you. This was, when I bought this had the hype sticker on it. In 1981, they released their very first live album I've called Snaz, but it's actually Snaz. Again, this is a US copy. I think it was supposed to be a gatefold. And this is a good double live album, actually. It's got a lot of their best known songs on it, and some of the songs, I mentioned Holiday before, a good example of a song that sounds a lot better live than it does in the album. It's not as pop sounding. Really good performances on here. This is one of the sleeves that came with it. And records are in really good shape. Use this US A&M. The label's the same as the Canadian ones. The printing is the US, the way the US stuff would print. If you love classic rock and you love live albums, I would check this one out. This isn't, it's not a 70s live album, but it's got the spirit of one. It's just really, really good. I've listened to this many, many times. And here's the other sleeve that came with it. Now this one's got some information. And also have this on CD, another Salvo reissue. So there you go. That tells you what it was supposed to look like as a gatefold. And I talked about this on some of my favorite reissues on that episode that Matt and I did, that the fact that this restored a lot of the bonus tracks that were done around this time. For instance, the song Crazy, A Suitable Case for Treatment, that was on the Heavy Metal soundtrack album. They were very smart to put that on here because it's from the same year. Extensive write-up on this. And yeah, you know, if you only had the Greatest Hits album and you said, well, where should I go next? I would sag into this one myself. Final album that they did for A&M worldwide came out in 1982. It's actually the last bit of vinyl I have to show you. And it's I only have it in this format. It's called 2XS. This is a Canadian issue. And this was a big album for them again in Canada. The song Love Leads to Madness almost hit the top 40. And another interesting thing about this, if you're a Canadian rock fan, there's a song on here called Dream On, which 5 years later Helix would record almost verbatim. They did very, very little to the arrangement, and they had a video and a single with that one, and this is where it originally appeared. So if you like the Helix version, pretty hard not to like this version because it's almost similar. And this was a good melodic rock album for them, actually. Still a 6-piece at this point. And the same A&M logo. So here's where I'm starting to miss a ton of their albums. 1983, they had Sound Elixir. 1984, they had an album called The Catch. And then another compilation came out, and I don't know how many countries it came out in, but I don't think it came out in the States, in 1984, called The Very, Very Best of Nazareth. I was a little surprised to find this. I bought this at Music World in Fredericton when it opened up in the late 90s. And this is almost an alternate greatest hits, but this has May the Sun Shine, Holiday, Dream On, Love Leads to Madness, things that aren't on the first Greatest Hits album. This is a good car CD to get. Not as easy as the Greatest Hits album, so get that if you don't have anything. But this is a Canadian A&M issue. And not much inside of this one for information. So big gap. I mean, we're jumping into the 90s. No, we're jumping beyond the 90s now. So 1986 they had Cinema. 1989 they had Snakes and Ladders. My understanding is that album is really hard to find on vinyl. In 1992 they had an album called No Jive. They had an album called Move Me in 94. And in 1998 they put an album called Boogaloo out. That was the last album to feature drummer Daryl Sweet. He passed away, sadly. And it was another 10 years before they'd release another studio album. But the next thing I have to talk about came out in, I believe, 2001. It's the only DVD I have by them. It's called Homecoming. And this was recorded in, they're from Scotland, so this was recorded in Scotland. And this is them as a 5-piece lineup with a keyboard player. They're actually heavy without. That kind of goes without saying. But a good bunch of songs on here. And this used to be available at some Walmarts. I don't know. It was, I remember thinking it's strange that I found this at a Walmart, but if you see it, pick it up. It's good. It also came out on CD, of course, and this is on Eagle Entertainment. So when Nazareth came to my hometown of Woodstock in 2010, I wanted to make sure I had something recent for them to sign if I got the chance to meet them. So I bought them the newest thing they put out, which was 2008, this album called The News, and which was really good. This was the first album that featured, I believe, Lee Agnew on drums, who's the son of Pete Agnew, because of course Daryl Sweet was there, and by this time Jimmy Murison was their guitar player, and that's the lineup that I saw. This is on Demolition Records and is a really, really good album. First new album that's not a reissue that came with an extensive CD book. Let's get all the lyrics and credits in it. The CD looks kind of cool. And I had Pete and Dan sign the inner tray. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to get the other two to sign it. So the next thing to come out after that was from Salvo, and I think this is when the reissue campaign came out. I hate to keep bringing up Walmart, but it's for some of us, it's the closest store we can drive to that sells any CDs, at least in normal circumstances. And I actually found this, which is a 2 CD anthology. And this starts at the Razmanaz album and goes all the way up to the News. And with a pretty extensive write-up. What's cool here is it's got some single covers of theirs, of which there have been a lot. Follow-up to the News came out in 2011. This one's on Eagle Records, and it's called Big Dogs. Another good, solid rock album. They've just kind of hit on a streak of just putting good, solid albums out. Not every one of their albums is great from start to finish. And this, of course, has all the lyrics and credits in it. Another 3 years before another album. By this time, in 2013, Dan McCafferty had retired from touring. He actually developed COPD, which meant that I think there was one show that he had to leave after 3 songs. So, you know, he figured that he could still record with them, but he can't do live stuff. So the last Nazareth album to feature the classic raspy vocals of Dan McCafferty came out 2014, Rock and Roll Telephone. This is a deluxe version on Union Square Music. 2 CD set with you know, the album on one side, a couple bonus songs and some live songs on side 2. And what's cool about the live songs is that they're all older Nazareth songs, but they aren't the obvious ones. They're a little bit deeper cuts. And it's easy to see that by this time, you know, Dan McCafferty's voice never really changed. He started out sounding, you know, like croaky and raspy in the coolest possible way. I'm not saying that in a put-down way. But you can tell that it was probably time for him to, you know, step away. Although he has recently released some solo material, and he hasn't ruled out, you know, doing another album with Nazareth. They replaced him with a guy named Linton Osborne, but he ended up ill, and he was replaced by another singer named Carl Sentence. If you're a really astute 80s metalhead, you might recognize him as being the singer from a band called Persian Risk. And the only other thing I know about that band is that the guitarist Phil Campbell was in that band, and he went on, of course, to join Motorhead, and he was with them for many, many years. And Carl doesn't sound like Dan, and to be honest, who he puts me in mind of is Bon Scott, which is interesting because a lot of people would think that Nazareth songs were AC/DC, but not because they sounded like Bon Scott, but because they sounded like Brian Johnson. But the end result of all that is what is so far the most recent Nazareth album, Tattooed on My Brain, which came out in 2018. This was their first that came out on Frontiers Records. A lot of their albums came out on different, smaller labels over the years, which is why some of them aren't that easy to find. This is a really strong album, and like I said, it's different vocally, but I can hear where he can sing their older stuff. So I expect the next thing we'll hear from them might be a live album or a DVD. So there you go. We've got Pete Agnew on bass, the sole remaining founding member of Nazareth, but you know, they're still together and they're still pumping out new music. So I've got a lot to get to before my collection is full, but that's a look at my Nazareth collection as it is right now. I'm interested to see what you people have out there. Are there any albums I don't have that I should jump to next by them? Let me know. Thanks for watching Tim's Final Confessions.